Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Elliott Driscoll. Looking forward to our conversation, as always, Elliott.
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me on, Simon. I appreciate it.
So, Elliott, regular listeners will have heard Elliott's dulcet tones before. Elliott is an adoptee and also a therapist. And as part of this series that we're running, kind of doing a deep dive into healing, we're exploring what healing means and what helps us heal from the guest's perspective. And maybe I'll sprinkle a little bit of my stuff in as well. But given Elliott is a therapist as well as an adoptee, I really want to mine his wisdom as painlessly as we can possibly do in the next hour. So what does healing mean to you, Elliott? And I guess if we could, because you've got the two hats, you've got the adoptee hat on and you've got the therapist hat on, I think I'd be really intrigued to hear the personal side of this,
Okay.
as well as the professional side. And what does healing mean to you?
Healing means going back and taking stock of things and sort of trying to figure out what it is that is, I guess, broken, right? What's damaged, and then trying to figure out a way to repair it, right? And trying not to get distracted by other things that can really spark a lot of emotion. And the truth is, I think that it's not so easy, and I'm not saying it's impossible. I don't think it is, but I do think it's and you've mentioned this before. I think it's hard, and for me, it's has been hard to get to the pre-verbal stuff. The pre-verbal stuff, it isn't located on the left side of the brain, it's located on the right side of the brain, or that's what we think we know, right? So that's implicit memory, not explicit memory. Now, what I do is I work in explicit memory. Like, that's what I do. I have facts, I have insights gained from other people, from my own practice, and I can talk about that stuff, but it's the other stuff, it's the emotional stuff that is from very, very early. It's difficult to get close to. I work in I work as a psychotherapist. I've been doing that for a little over 20 years, and I have not yet done some of the therapies that are involved in processing early childhood trauma, pre-verbal trauma. So I have done a lot of. I've surrounded myself with a community of people. I got sober a long time ago. I'm involved in helping others. I have just great friends who are really supportive, who don't necessarily understand adoption, but they themselves have traumas that they've worked on healing, and so I think it's in the community that we get better. That's what I think. I think the support is critical. Yeah.
So what you're alluding to, or what, if I'm hearing you're right. On one hand, you're talking about taking stock, which is quite an intellectual pursuit, but you're also talking about getting at the stuff that's in the implicit part of our mind, which it isn't in the intellectual realm.
Correct. Yeah. It's something learned earlier, probably in images, right, and certainly in feelings. That's going to affect how we think, how we process information, how we show up, how we take in information, how we code it, and how we store it, right? it affects us when we don't know it's affecting us. It's the what we don't know part of knowledge.
Wow. So it is coming out of the fog, and some people think about this as a one-off thing, and some people think it's a series of exits from the fog. It is coming out of the fog, the big one, right? Is that when the implicit stuff becomes explicit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It's certainly when it comes out. I guess as it comes out, we now have a way, because we speak now and we have these symbols that are, words and things that represent it. But I don't know if it has to be encoded in words for us to heal from it. Maybe it does. I think we have to see it and we have to experience it. That's my sense. Because Bessel van der Kolk talks about the body keeps the score, right? It's such an important thing, because all of this stuff is stored somewhere, right? The memories are stored somewhere. They come through the right-hand side of the brain. They seem to come through the right-hand side of the brain, but they're stored. So the fact that they're still there and they still affect us, we need to change them to look at life differently, or to at least realize that we were looking at life in a way that wasn't compatible with how life is, or at least how we best adapt to life.
So is there an intrinsic kind of challenge in us having an intellectual conversation about something that is not intellectual?
I guess we could sort of scream at one another with primal screams, or we could grunt at one another and feel. I don't know if you're listening, people would appreciate that. I think they'd be tuning into CNN shortly there. I think that this is the best we can do, right? In terms of that, the experience is so emotional that, I guess the best we can do is describe it and talk about the path to get there. Right.
So let's do that then. What does that? You've mentioned you've come out very strongly in aligned with this. Community is part of the path, or it helps being in community when we're on our own path. But what does the path look like?
Yeah. So the healing, right? Different levels. One of the parts of healing is sort of making sense of, the birth family, and going back and meeting the birth family, and sort of realizing that you indeed are, or I am indeed a human being. I do remember I read that book. I read, I forget whose book it was. Can't remember her name, but it wasn't the Very A book. It was another one. Betty Jean Lifton's book. And, they talk about the adoptee not even knowing they were born, not being sure they were born, right? It's a weird experience, but I definitely had that, and when I finally met my birth family and cousins and all this stuff, and just, felt that the comfort with them, that was an important part of it. So that's getting closer to it, right? That's feeling normal. And then, as you go further, you start to get closer to the trauma. And for me, it has been, I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. And, that sort of behavior, right? Not paying attention, right? And certainly impulsivity. It's been a problem, part of my life. Exercise has helped mitigate against it, but, it's been there. And, do I have attention deficit disorder, or, is it a trauma response? Or is it both? Am I disassociating, right? And used to think that disassociation was this major thing where you faded off and you were nowhere, and maybe you developed different personalities. And so I confused it with dissociative identity disorder. But, dissociation happens when you're getting triggered and thinking of things that probably aren't helpful to you in that certain situation. That looks an awful lot like ADD, an awful lot.
Yeah.
And getting emotionally triggered can look a lot like impulsivity. So there's research being done on, are they the same thing? How are they different, and all of that. So I guess for me, it's trying to figure out how things aren't working. And, some of that is, when do I get triggered? I tend to have pretty significant amount of anxiety when I'm asked to be somewhere at a certain time. Like today, Thanksgiving, I'm going to hang out with my girlfriend's family. It should be lovely, but like many things that I do where I'm asked to show up into a gathering, I feel really anxious about it. And what's that from? Is it insecure attachment? And does that insecure attachment come from an early experience? I have a lot of questions. So I think for me, it's building, right? My collection of all this stuff and trying to figure out, and I do that with a good group of friends who point out things to me that aren't helpful and who continue to love me despite the fact that some of this behavior isn't ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can't, some of this stuff we can't think our way out of, though, right?
I think we can think our way to the doorway.
Okay.
Right, the doorway of healing, right, is getting us there. And so what I'm in the process of preparing for this, kind of going into the feelings. And I'm a little embarrassed to say, as a psychotherapist, I haven't done that yet. And so I look forward to taking that leap, even though I don't take a whole lot of action towards it on an everyday basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Because what we're talking about here is wounds to the psyche, aren't we? We're talking about wounds to the psyche. So for me, there's some of the other conversations that I've been having in this series have been looking at things perhaps from looking at healing at different sorts of healings. So physical healing, spiritual healing, and the one that we're talking about here, psychological healing. And we can kind of, so some of the things that I'm learning from other people is we can look at those separately from the point of a conversation. But really we would be looking holistically. We would be looking at all of those parts and the interaction between all of those parts. So I think one of the concerns that I have from my own experience is overthinking and the rabbit hole of the rabbit hole of assigning. So I heard this great word. I mentioned it on the podcast I recorded a little bit earlier on. I heard this word earlier on called assignment. So it's like a better word for blaming, right?
Okay.
So am I assigning my am I assigning my anxiety to adoption, or am I assigning it to, say, stress from business, right? Insecurity and concerns from business, and that whole kind of it's a rabbit hole. For me, the rabbit hole is a vortex going down and down, trying to assign the cause of my behavior, assign the cause of my feeling, assign the cause of my thought. And I found that I found that fairly fruitless most of the time, and I guess I do it a little bit less than I used to. But yeah, that assigning thing is trying to attribute something to something can be it's an intellectual for me. It's an intellectual pursuit that has been largely fruitless.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder, I mean, for me, I wonder if it's, and maybe it is. I wonder if it is because, anytime I'm going to make a major decision, and sort of going into trauma feels like a major decision. I don't want to get re-traumatized, right? There is that. And what we know about this isn't great, right? So, I'm cautious. And being overly cautious is the risk. But if I buy an automobile and I'm going to spend whatever they cost right now, like $4 million or whatever it is, feels like,
Yeah.
I research it, I look at, oh, is this going to work? And I read reviews and I do that. And it's sort of important that I do that so that I feel comfortable going into it. I guess the alternative is sort of not knowing anything about it, not knowing I'm making the decision, and sort of getting pushed off the diving board, so to speak. So I go swimming, as my mother helped me to do when I was a kid, and sort of helped me learn to love the diving board.
Right.
So I don't want to make that wrong necessarily, but the part that's tough, I do EMDR, right? So eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and in that you do get people who are so, I believe it's so intellectually based that they can't open up to it, right? They can't let go. And yeah, that is a risk because it doesn't work. It doesn't work on those people, or at least my training hasn't allowed me to work with those people just yet. So maybe there are people who can work with those people. I don't know how to do it yet. And they're kind of few and far between. Often people who work in spaces where, intellectual, being intellectual is, you must be. I found attorneys don't do it real well.
Yeah. So I want to just jump back to the car analogy for the the research process. So you said, well, I can do my research, or the other option, and look at how this car is going to be. The other option is just to buy what you've always bought. So that's the whole purpose of the brand. So BMW have a small. This doesn't really apply to much as it used to do. But in the old days, the car companies wanted to lure you in with a small car and then keep you upselling you to the bigger car. And that's the whole point of the brand value. That's keeping you stuck. Yeah, it's not keeping you stuck. So a lot of car advertising isn't to get you to buy their car. It's actually to make you comfortable about the choice that you've made in the past. So the BMW is the ultimate driving machine. So here we are, we're you Elliott, you, me Simon, me Patricia. Like, you've made a good decision. You're driving the ultimate driving machine. So stick with us and our brand. And what that makes me think about is the belief thing, right? So on one side, we're talking about being curious, right? The research process. I need to buy a car. I'll do my research. I'm curious. I'm not sure what's the right car for me. I will do my research. I will do my due diligence. On the other side, I've always had BMWs. I've always had Audis. I'm just going to stick with it. So the analogy works to me in terms of curiosity. So you talked about your conversations with your friends and thinking about your own thoughts, and that leading you to the door where healing is going to be happening. That's like researching the car to buy rather than just sticking what you've always had, right?
Am I okay with how it's going? Am I doing it well enough, or is there a better deal somewhere else? Right? Do I get a really great driving machine for, $10,000 less, right? It's not the greatest driving machine or the ultimate driving machine, but it's darn good, and I only have to pay $10,000 less, something like that, an alternative, right? And I guess no decision is a decision.
Yeah, just sticking with it. Yeah.
And I think I guess it's a danger. One of the dangers is getting stuck in some part of the process, right? Is focusing on some other part of the whole adoption experience. Sort of fighting the good fight, and we were done wrong and all that kind of stuff. And that's there is that fight to fight to some degree, but ultimately we have to recover, and we have to become our full selves, despite the fact that we've been through an experience that not a whole lot of people really understand.
Yeah. So how do you see this focus that you're talking about there? So if I was to kind of sum it up, I'd say that kind of like the focus on the past, or the focus on the external, right? So I need to adoption is bad. Adoption is bad. I need to focus my efforts on changing adoption, or abolishing adoption, rather than I need to focus myself on myself.
Yeah. So very interesting. I've been doing some reading on, EMDR. There's EMDR for pre-verbal trauma, right? And what they talk about, one of the things that seems to come up is when people are, sort of in that state where they're going through, the trauma's coming out, they don't know that it's not present, right? That there's seems to be no distinction between the present and the past, right? That this happened for me like 57 years ago, right? And that, one of the goals of this, or one of the factors that's really critical, I think, so as not to re-traumatize people, is that, you have to help people understand that that's not currently happening, that it happened in the past. That's how real, I think, that some of these feelings and responses can feel to a person almost on a daily basis, right? How real they are. And that's I would think that's the implicit memory, right? That's the filter that we're running everything through, and we don't even know we're running it through. So it really feels present, I gather.
So because the mind can't determine between the past, the present, and the future. So what came to mind as you were describing that is a friend of mine. So this is nothing to do with adoption, right? But it's an interesting and similar analogy. He was talking about not wanting to. He was talking about not wanting to pick up the phone and speak to a potential client. And I'd heard something about fear of flying, right? So if we were afraid of flying, then we would be afraid when we're in the air. But we're not. We're afraid when we think about the trip that involves a flight.
Well, I see where you're going.
Yeah. So the mind can't tell the difference between the past, the current, and the future, and it's a memory of the past trauma, or a projection of the future trauma. That's what's kind of going on.
Yeah, it's a lack of trust that we'll be in control when that happens.
So how would this relate to kind of being triggered then?
um, being triggered would feel very real, right? It would feel like whatever it is that is triggering us, that is true, when in fact, by calling it a trigger, we understand that it's not true, that it's actually the implicit filter that we're running it through that makes it feel very real. Does that make sense?
I think so. What I came up with this was because I like to kind of like extend the metaphor, extend the metaphor. So what does, so being triggered, okay, we pull a trigger, and there's an explosion happens within the gun, and the metal bit shoots out and it does some damage, right? Or what if we are triggered, but there's a blank, right? So the trigger is pulled, there is an explosion, but it's a blank. There's no bullet, it's just a sound. And then we're feeling the explosion within, the explosion of anger or insecurity or whatever it is, but it doesn't do any damage outside. Or we pull the trigger, and we've got it's one of those revolver guns, right? It's a revolver gun, and it's got 8 holes, and it's got 8 slots for 8 bullets. We pull the trigger, and the trigger just hits an empty chamber. So it hits an empty chamber, and what that means is that somebody says something to us, like, have you ever thought about finding your real mum? Right? So when that might have triggered us in the past, led to explosion, that it actually, when that, a sign of us healing is when there is no explosion, because the trigger has been pulled, the same thing has been said, but it hasn't had the same reaction to us. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so let me just figure out if I am understanding you right. Is that, we're getting, let's say, right, we go through this experience, and let's say, we're born, and we know the smell of this woman, and we know her touch and her feel and how she moves, and every time she coughs, we know what that sounds like, I guess, from inside. And then we're born, and all of a sudden, whether it's we're with her for I don't know how long, maybe not at all, we're taken away, and there is that initial breach of contract, right? There's some part of us that tells us that this is not good, right? This is not good. This is, how do I protect myself? What do I do? I'm wet, I'm hungry, and people aren't paying attention to me like she would, right? Because she knows me. So,
but we don't. You're putting that into words.
Well, I'm doing.
We don't have any words.
I'm doing that to understand it.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is, and obviously words don't do it justice. They aren't great at portraying. This picture is worth 1,000 words, let's say, and it's actually a movie, not even a picture. So it's a gazillion pictures. So this whole experience we have, and that goes into the implicit memory, right? And so every time we have the experience of, or at least most of the times, we have the experience of people wanting to make social contracts with us, we all of a sudden doubt them, right? Again, words don't do it justice. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, if it shoots blanks and it doesn't pan out that we can't trust those people, you would think there would be some sort of extinction there, right? That feeling that I have would go away over time, right? And so I think what you're asking is, why doesn't it? Is that true?
I'm just making a distinction between a cause that's, sorry. There's an event. So somebody says, have you ever thought about finding your real mum, Simon? Okay. and that triggers in me some anger, some feeling of insecurity, some denial, or it causes an effect, right? It causes an effect. But the mark of healing is when somebody says something to it, somebody says the same thing to us, and it doesn't cause the explosion.
That's correct.
So that's when it's when the trigger has been pulled on an empty chamber in the revolver of the gun.
So, yeah, I agree. And I want to go back to something you said, or we talked about earlier, this idea that implicit memory, does it become words? Does it have to become words in order to heal? And I guess I think it does, right? I think it does. Our ability to understand that means that we've resolved it, right? To be able to talk about it seems like if we're able to talk about it without emotion, then it's resolved, right? That we can see it as something that, we can see the pluses of it, we can see the minuses of it. It's one of the, I think, important psychotherapy is to be able to look at things dispassionately.
So I'm doing some therapy at the moment, and we're actually just working on feelings. We're just working on body stuff.
Wow, good for you.
And well, so we chat for a couple of minutes, then we do some body stuff for 45 minutes or so, and then we come back to the words at the end. But we just do the body stuff. So I feel, so when you were talking about that anxiety about the arrangements for later on in the day, something hit me, and I didn't know what it was, but I can feel it. I can feel it now, and I'm actually getting tingly all over from it right now.
Wow.
And it's going to my hands. Right. So and what do we do with the hands? We do something. Like it's an anxiety thing. I can feel the tingling going up and down my arms. And for me, this is a kind of like priming me for action. I need to do something. So we're just sitting, and it feels, you said good for you, and I'm just thinking, I was explaining this to somebody else earlier on today, and it's just come. No, it's come back. The memory one. It feels very. It feels almost delusional. It feels almost as if this is. The therapist asks questions about the feelings going around my body, and it feels like I'm making the feelings up. And that far, you talked earlier on about intellectual, like working with intellectual people or working with people that use their intellect a lot. And as I'm talking to my therapist, Rachel, I realize how much stuffing I've been doing, how much I've been living in the intellect rather than my body, how much I've been priming myself to action. I need to take action. So it is that in going to those pre-verbal spaces. Can you tell us a little bit more about the EMDR side of that? And because what I was thinking about, I was using the analogy of the cars earlier on, and I was thinking, well, you could get, if you're an adoptee, you could kind of be overwhelmed by the choices of different therapy.
Yeah, I guess, and I don't know how to choose. I don't know enough to know how to choose. But you know, and I don't know that much about EMDR and early childhood trauma work. I'm learning about it. I do know that it's pretty high association with pretty significant verbal outbursts. They call them abreaction, right? When, you know, you just, emotion pours out of you. And, you know, in EMDR for that, they talk about really trying to manage that pretty closely, because again, that can be re-traumatizing, right, if it gets away. So they talk about doing it in increments, really incrementally, so that it feels safe and the person feels like they can go on, and that it's not too overwhelming. I don't know enough about it at this point, how it differs from standard EMDR. You know, so EMDR is getting to, you know, early memories that seem to have been encoded in words, right? That at least we have some of the words. We can remember the memory in pictures and in video and describe them with words, whereas the earlier stuff, we didn't have words to encode them, so it's encoded primarily in, I think, in pictures, or, you know, experiences, feelings. It's probably, our feelings were probably a lot more together and confused, I guess, and maybe not necessarily in a bad way, but you know, sight, sound, hearing, smell, touch, all sort of went into the same bin. So, you know, that stuff, entangling that stuff and having it come out might feel a little bit scary, I would think.
I can remember physical touch making me stiffen. So I'm thinking, is that part of what you were talking about earlier on about the lack of familiarity? The unfamiliar, we know the smell of our birth mothers and their voice and their touch and all that stuff, and then we lose that, and it's replaced by unfamiliar smells.
Yeah, I don't have any idea why it would be that you would stiffen as a result of being touched, right? It could be a whole bunch of different things. You know, to the extent that it is, you know, an implicit encoded memory because of something that happened earlier, I guess you would have to get to that to find out if that were the case, right? And that affects, obviously, pretty big effect on attachment, right? Because, you know, these things can make us really emotionally dysregulated. They can make us impulsive. They can make us distracted and confused, right? With disassociation. So, you know, if I'm sort of off in la la land thinking about something else and somebody touches me, it might scare the bejesus out of me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. The other thing that I'm coming across my mind is, you know, because I've spent so much time in the business, that, you know, my intellectual brain has been absorbed by solving business problems for a lot of my life, right? I think in business, we're looking for the silver bullet. Right? What's the thing that's gonna drive the top line and increase the bottom line? We're looking at what's the silver bullet, and I'm thinking that maybe what we're doing, whereas so we spend all our time trying to identify something rather than running experiments. So the main difference between overthinking and experimenting, and I'm kind of thinking that that's what I've been looking for in the healing bit, right? So I've been looking for the silver bullet rather than doing experiments. And at stages, I have done experiments. So this latest thing with this thing that I'm doing with the therapist, that is an experiment. I'm coming at it from a point of, like you mentioned, a lot of people are talking to me about, a lot of therapists are talking to me about pre-verbal stuff. Maybe I've done a load of the intellectual stuff. Maybe I need to do some of more of the pre-verbal stuff. Have an experiment. So it's coming from a place of exploration, experimentation, curiosity, rather than, if this thing doesn't work, then that's it. You know, putting like that expectations, not having too high expectations of it.
Yeah, it makes sense. When these two guys, Prochaska and DiClemente, came up with the stages of change model, right? Preparation is one of the stages. And during that stage, people are sort of figuring it out, collecting resources, making sense of things, getting information. And that preparation stage is really critical for the action stage, right? So you're getting ready. And when people are getting ready, it sometimes means that they'll take action. Doesn't always, but sometimes it does. And it often means that they've made a decision to look into this. It's just not knowing where it's going to come out. I like your idea of the golden bullet. It's like the magic pill, right? And I have an old therapist who was psychodynamic, and some people really bristle at the idea of psychodynamic psychotherapy. But he used to say, you know, it's like the breast, you know, when you're a little child and you're breastfeeding, you know, it solves all your problems. You know, it gives you nurturance, there's warmth. You know, if you're crying, and, you know, you put a child on the breast and they'll tend to calm down. Not always, but often. So this idea that I'm going to find this, you know, this sort of the fountain of all healing and recovery, probably unlikely, although I'm sure, you know, we can make great strides. EMDR, you know, helped me quite a bit years ago, where I had this recurring memory of a traumatic event that was really bugging me, and had bugged me for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And after I did EMDR, I haven't had a recurrence of that ever. And that was 15 years ago, I think, at this point.
Wow.
Yeah. So there are some really good solutions out there. It's just trying to figure out how much is in there and how much of the work has to be done in order for us to experience what we feel is recovery. One more thing on that is, you know, I've seen patients who we do some really good work on trauma, right? Processing some pretty significant traumas. You know, one guy, you know, not to be gross, but he saw a car accident where a child was decapitated, and he was in a car accident where two people were hit and killed, and these were just awful. And the poor guy, you know, and he came in, and, you know, we did EMDR on those, and they don't seem to bother him so much anymore. And there's all this other stuff that he didn't, you know, really want to talk about, because he was so relieved with these other things. Now, you know, if you have, you know, a pretty large stone in your shoe, and you take that, you walk around with it for a while, and you take that piece out, and you got a little tiny stick, which it bugs you, but it doesn't bug you that much as compared to the stone. You might walk around for quite some time with that stick still in there. So, and that's a choice, right?
Yeah. So we're not consciously choosing trauma, but I guess some of us are consciously choosing not to experiment. Are we afraid? What's going on?
For me, I'll just put it in my terms. Sometimes I don't trust that this is going to work out. And right, that's sort of the double-edged sword with the adoptee, right? we protect ourselves by not trusting, right? We don't want this thing to happen all over again. And God knows I don't want to be abandoned by a major love object again. That's the worst, pretty much up there is the worst thing that can happen, right? Yet, I also want to feel more comfortable, but trusting that somebody's going to be able to help me is sort of, it's like this person who tried to help me by giving birth to me and maybe breastfeeding me for a minute, they certainly helped me in that moment, but certainly left me a little cold, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It sounds pretty scary. So that sounds like a good sign to me to dig a little bit deeper. So can you go?
Yeah. So let's say the implicit memory makes us not trust, right? So, avoidantly attached, insecurely attached, those sorts of things, right? So if I'm not all that trusting of stuff, and you tell me that there's this therapy that's going to help me, I'm not so sure, right? And does that come from, a place where the person who does the therapy or how the therapy is described is not good? Probably not. It probably comes from my implicit memory. Like, maybe just likely, I don't know. But it certainly makes us, I think, less likely to take risks.
Yeah. A funny thing, well, funny now, but not at the time, but I've had loads of coaching, but very, very little therapy. So I went looking for a therapist on 7 or 8 years ago, and I spoke to a few, and I picked one of them. But one of them actually, I was doing what I would consider as due diligence, right? Asking the therapist questions. And she turned it back on me to question my questions. And I found that excruciating, and obviously didn't work I didn't work with her. And then a couple of years ago, I heard this phrase gaslighting, and I realized that that's what she was doing. So she had something going on in her head about adoptees not trusting people. And when I asked her questions about her work, she reflected that back to me. And I was asking reasonable questions, as in, can you tell me about some of the results you've had with other clients? And she said, well, it won't be appropriate to name names. And I never asked her to name names. And there was other stuff like that going on. So it's that's what comes to my mind when I hear about trust. But obviously, we're talking about trust in different contexts. Trust in terms of romantic relationships, and trust in terms of.
No, I think it's very similar. I mean, somebody who doesn't build rapport with you before they start reflecting back to you these trust versus I mean, plain as the nose on your face that people are going to want to feel a little bit more comfortable and ask some questions at the beginning of therapy. That's normal, right? Does that mean you're untrusting? I don't know. Maybe you just want to feel like you're getting the right person, and you quickly did know if you were getting the right person because she didn't react in the right way. So that was very effective on your part, it seems like.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah. I like that turnaround. So what you've talked a lot about the community vibe, and we've talked about self-reflection and other people reflecting stuff back on us. I think that's what you talked about, the community. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I had the experience, I don't know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, of being part of a group of adoptees a core group of probably 4 or 5, probably, and then some other people that sort of drifted in and out, that where I believe each person that was there did a lot of work on, whether it was reuniting with their birth parents or understanding more about, what they were going through, but it was very validating. And one of the things that, growing up and, having people tell me that I was chosen rather than relinquished and all this stuff, that it really helped and really made me more interested in looking into it and sort of being comfortable with it. And I think it was during that time, I'm pretty sure, that my biological father had told me that my birth mother was soon going to die, very shortly. And so my son and I drove to Canada 18 hours and I was with her when she passed. That was a great experience. And I don't know if I would have done that had I not been in the group. I just felt really comfortable, sort of dealing with that sort of thing. And I didn't know her very well. I knew a bunch of things about her. We had some interaction. She was pretty prickly as a result of a lot of trauma that she'd been through, but it enabled me to get beyond some of the difficult feelings I had toward her and sort of go up and be there for her, which I hope was, helpful to her. She wasn't in a state where she was that conscious, but it was nice. So I had a good experience, and I believe a lot of the other people in the group had a good experience as well.
Yeah. So one of the questions that comes to my mind on that, and from a point of view of what stops us healing, it could be kind of like stewing in our own juices and like remaining isolated.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, but as soon as I'm thinking that, I'm thinking about apparently it's a lot of people who are going through depression will withdraw, right? And they become, and their world closes down at the exact point where they need community, whether it's to people to lift their spirits or what. So there's a challenge there, right?
Yeah, it really is. This idea of, who can you rely on to give you a good, a response that's fortifying rather than diminishing.
Yeah.
And I agree with you with people, people with depression, classically, they assume that people don't like them and are treating them as charity case, and they don't want to be a burden and all this stuff, which feels very, very real at the time, right?
One of the things that's popped for me that I've become conscious of this week is the fact that some adoptee social media stuff that I see triggers me. It re-traumatizes me, and now I can. Now I've spotted that. I've actually realized that that's probably been going on for me for like 2.5 years.
What sort of stuff is the stuff that, if you feel comfortable talking about it, I don't want you to reach yourself on.
Well, it's the stuff that's about reinforcing the trauma. It's the stuff that reinforces the trauma. So some people that would call themselves advocates are wanting the external world, i.e. people outside of adoptee land or the adoption constellation, whatever people call it, that they're wanting people to recognize the trauma so they're talking a lot about trauma, and that re-traumatizes me. I'm angry about that.
Right. Are they talking about the injustice of the trauma?
All sorts. All sorts. So sometimes they're talking about the injustice. More. It's more so the stuff about the trauma itself. Like, validate we're hurting, recognize our stuff, and instead of me being graceful or being supportive, it's actually making me, I find it makes me, I don't think, can you be slightly angry? It's making me uncomfortable, probably, when I see it.
I think it was a previous podcast, or maybe you and I were chatting. You had talked about an experience, I guess, in maybe a Facebook group or something like that, where you had sort of had a negative reaction to somebody and posted it and felt pretty bad about the responses you got because of felt like you had, I think I'm right in saying you felt like you had overreacted.
I think what you're talking about. No, I unless it's a different one. So what happened? Sorry, listeners. I'll explain what happened. So an adoptee put a post and it was in a group, and it was quite dark, and it had some valid points on it. And I got to the end, and I thought I was expecting some light at the end of this post, and so I made a comment about it. Good points. Have you thought about what about that? And I got they came back at me, and then other started people joining in, and I realized that I'd inadvertently caused some upset. They accused me of toxic positivity, so I realized that I had inadvertently upset somebody. Obviously, I don't want to do that, so I deleted my post. And then somebody put on just before I left the group, said he's deleted his reply. He hasn't even got the courage of his own convictions. And I thought, well, no, I have got the courage of my convictions. But I don't want to upset anybody, so I'm exiting stage left. And off you go. So is that the one you were talking about? Is that?
It sounds like.
Yeah. So the stuff that's been happening for me this week there hasn't been any interaction. It's just stuff that I've seen, and I've realized that instead of being empathetic, instead of being thinking about them, I've been thinking about me, or I've been triggered. That their comments about adoptee trauma have triggered me, made me angry.
Yeah. It's interesting. I had an experience this morning. I was in an AA meeting, and there was somebody who spoke who speaks like every day, and I judged that as the wrong thing to do, or I did then, and then I sort of look at it, and for me it was, and this is like a Jungian idea, right? That we don't see our own shadow, right? We see in other people's behavior our own shadow, things that we don't want to own, right? So what I saw in her was this: how dare she look for attention or get attention, right? Because in fact, that's what I want, right? I want attention, and I want and damn her, she shares every day. I don't share at all. I'm so much better than her. Well, actually, she's not the victim, right? I'm the one playing the victim, and it's hard, because I was judging her like that for a month, right? Kept waiting for her to speak, and she'd speak, and I'd be like, God, this woman, who does she think she is? All she's doing, she's sharing in an AA meeting. That's what you're supposed to do,
Yeah.
And here I am deciding that she shouldn't get so much attention, really, because I wasn't trying, I wasn't taking care of myself. I was just, so I don't want to belabor it.
That's the same. Yeah. But there's a smile, right? It's the it's the difference between, a Charlton Heston realization, like in one of those biblical kind of 60s or 70s film where, he puts his head, he's this 6'4" alpha male leader, who is, playing Moses or whatever, and he puts his head to his hand, and he's had a Charlton Heston recognition, a moment, an epiphany, and it's this big heroic thing, right? And then there's the Homer Simpson one where we go, "Do, I've done it again," and we laugh, laugh at ourselves, and we have grace. We have grace for our judgment of others, and hopefully the lesson sinks in until the next time.
Going back to what we were talking about in this as well, it's the understanding that provides the relief, right? I go, oh, I want attention, and here she is getting attention. And when I understand, I don't have to fear it.
That's There's I said wisdom at the top, and there's a conversation, and you were shucks kind of modesty, right? But there's huge in there. There's the understanding the understanding brings, what did you say, release or relief?
It brings relief, right?
Relief, yeah.
Right. So many examples, right? Religion is based on that, right? People are afraid, they don't know what's going on, so in some cases, let's create this thing that help us feel comforted, right?
So the other thing that popped into my head, and the especially on the laughter thing, is a great comedian. So some comedians will tell a story, and they'll eke out the story, and then you don't know where they're going. They're creating a tension within you, and then you laugh at the joke in the relief.
Yes.
And there's a massive distinction between laughing at the joke and then what happens when you don't laugh at the next joke. And maybe it's in a one-to-one it's a one-to-one conversation. A friend is telling you a joke, and they you don't laugh, and so they feel that they have to explain why the joke is funny. And you're still not laughing, or you're thinking, I can see that is funny. That's a kind of like the difference between an intellectual understanding and laughing. And that, I think, is very relevant somehow to our conversation, right? Because the pre-verbal is the laughter. The non-verbal is the laughter. The difference between theory and practice, the difference between a nice idea and like an embodied experience, the difference, like spiritual bypass. Somebody talks about this. Jill, that we did the last podcast with, she talked about spiritual bypassing, which is, saying you're whole, and then saying that you're whole, saying that you heal, saying that you're healed, and then kicking your cat or something like that. Like it's the difference between saying something and doing something. It's the gap between knowledge and action.
Right. It's the difference between self and ego, right? And the whole idea, ego is who I want you to think I am, and self is who I actually am.
Yeah.
Right.
So is the ego what needs to heal? Because I kind of
It at least covers up what needs to heal, I think. I mean, I don't know, but it certainly, I think it represents insecurity, right? I'm not sure I'm okay.
Yeah.
So I put these things around me so that you think I'm okay, and then it's a lot of song and dance,
Yeah.
smoke and
mirrors.
but
Yeah.
relationships, right?
So
Because you can never trust that somebody else likes you.
you can never trust that somebody else likes you.
That's what the ego does, right? The greater the ego, the less you can believe that other people actually like you. They may like the things that you've represented that you are, but to the extent that you're not those things, they don't actually like you. They like those things, or they like your reflection in those things, right?
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a subject for another day, my friend.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. It is. It's so it's interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm conscious of time. Have you got something?
I realize we got to end, I guess. This whole idea of fighting, and I think it's great. Fight for rights, and kids don't have right. All that stuff. I think that's great. I think it's important, and being fighting against something and going after it is sort of going at something that instead of doing the work. I actually don't know where I'm going with this, so I better shut up. I had a good idea just a minute ago, and it's
so I think are you talking about a tension between a tension? Sorry, not as in attention, but you're talking about tension existing between trying to change the world outside us or doing the internal work.
Yeah. Just like I pointed at this lady who was doing what she was supposed to be doing and shows that she is wrong. I wasn't looking at what I needed. So it's really important that I do justice to myself.
Yeah. Look within. Okay, thank you very much for taking an hour of your time on Thanksgiving. It's really appreciate that. And thank you to listeners. And we'll speak to you again very soon.